All right, good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a great night. My name is Stacy Ruddy, and I am the president-elect for Colorado PTA. In my civilian life, I also work as a family nurse practitioner, so I'm super excited for this presentation this morning on supporting students' mental health during a pandemic. And I see that Sarah, you got logged in okay. So I'm going to turn it right over to Sarah Youngren, who is our speaker this morning, to introduce herself a bit. And I will be here if you need me, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I thought we were starting at 9:30, so I'm a little running a little late, so I apologize for that. But I'm really excited to be here today to talk about how to support our children and their mental health during this pandemic, and also how we consider to support them as we move towards the future. So I'm just getting ready to share my screen here. Is that working for everyone?
Yes, it does seem to be working.
Okay, great. So I'll start a little bit by sharing just a little bit about my background. So I'm a clinical social worker and have worked as a child and family therapist for the last 13 years. And in my work, I really specialize in supporting children and families that have experienced trauma using concepts of neuroscience and supporting families and children to build their own resiliency during difficult life transitions or during periods of adversity. On the other half of my practice, I work as a school mental health consultant for schools and districts across the state of Colorado. And I work with schools and districts in the development and enhancement and implementation of comprehensive school mental health strategies based on evidence-informed best practices. And so some of the work I do with school districts is really supporting them in implementing some of these best practices. I'll talk about some of what these are as we move on, but really supporting districts to think about how to embed social emotional learning, trauma-informed practices, and staff wellness into their school cultures. So today I'll spend just a little bit of time talking about the data and what we know about our children's mental health, what we were seeing before the pandemic and now in the midst of it. And then we'll discuss strategies of what we can do to support all children, and then how can we really partner with schools to make sure all students are getting the support that they need. So to start, what did children's mental health look like in our state before the pandemic? We knew that mental health problems were common amongst our youth. Students, families, parents, teachers were all saying, we have to do something about this mental health crisis. So more than a third of Colorado students said they felt sad or hopeless for more than 2 weeks out of the school year. And 1 in 8 students were diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, which is the most common mental health problem among our youth. And mental health needs were on the rise, according to providers and to schools. And less than half of these students with mental health needs received or will receive the treatment that they need. And sadly, suicide for many years and in 2019 was the leading cause of death for 10 to 24-year-olds. So then the pandemic hit. And as we just saw, mental health problems were nothing new to us in children, but the intensity has changed. So we know that the pandemic has had a profound impact on children's mental health. And while this is expressing itself in a variety of ways, child by child, overall, kids are reporting a loss of future orientation and a sense of control in their environment. Students' sense of belonging has also been impacted, and their sense of hope. So hope and for the future, and hope in having a sense of control over our environments is fundamentally important for children and adolescents' sense of self-efficacy, and is a strong protective factor for the prevention of more serious mental health problems. And in many children, this has been compromised. So based on research from the nonprofit Mental Health America, Loneliness and isolation were cited as the #1 factor contributing to increased depression and anxiety rates, according to screenings that they have available on their website. 78% of respondents aged 11 to 17 who completed a mental health screening reported experiencing significant loneliness. The number of screenings completed by youth also increased dramatically. I think this is an indicator that our students are really feeling the consequences and looking for answers and for seeking support. At Children's Hospital Colorado, the overall volume of emergency department visits dropped by about 50% from pre-pandemic numbers. However, mental health related visits have doubled since the pandemic. And across our state in Children's Hospital, there has also been a 10% increase in the number of kids who visit the psychiatric emergency department unit due to thoughts of suicide. This is profound, not only in the presence of suicidal thoughts and ideation, but also, I believe, in help-seeking behavior. So again, I think we're becoming, and so are our youth, really more aware of the impact of our mental health on our well-being. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused many of us, not just our children, to feel more stressed and anxious in the wake of so much uncertainty. We've all missed significant life events, milestones, and many of us have suffered losses to varying degrees. It has been and is still a threat to our physical safety and removes our sense of control in our environment and our future planning. So as a result, I believe that we can see the pandemic as collective societal trauma that is causing us to experience and live in acute stress. And we know that when we're in acute stress, our brains really start to operate in survival mode. It temporarily changes the way that our brains process information. And then we are at risk of suffering impaired behavior consequences or impaired thinking consequences. We generally become less grounded and more reactive. So think about this in the context of a child who is working hard to learn and adapt and grow. Their mental health, as we see, is impacted, in a variety of different ways. But their caregivers, us, have also been greatly impacted. And we know the impact that we have on our children directly affects their well-being. So not surprisingly, students' mental health experiences during the pandemic have been mixed. Some kids have thrived. They like sleeping in a bit more, getting more snacks, getting outside more, having more breaks, and having a bit of distance from the intensity of the school day. And so for those students who already struggled with some degree of anxiety with social interactions or peers or struggling with their confidence in these interactions, being virtual was a way for them to manage their anxiety. So my son, who was in kindergarten last year and is in first grade now, has always been a bit unsure of himself around peers. And he, during the first few months of the pandemic and going to school remotely, just seemed more at ease, seemed a bit happier and more relaxed. But I saw as time went on and he truly began to lose connection to all that his school provided him, loss of family gatherings, our vacations, birthday parties, and play dates, he started expressing his dislike of not being able to be with his friends and family. The distance eventually started to wear on him. What we're seeing now is that as students return to in-person learning, there is a greater increase in social anxiety. So this applies to students like my son, but also to students that are typically very comfortable with social interactions or thrive in these interactions. The National Social Anxiety Center states, we've been in shutdown mode and we've let our social muscles deteriorate. So many students will need to relearn these skills and their confidence at using these skills. So An 8th grade student in New York wrote to her counselor and said, "I would like you to call me. This whole pandemic has really been frightening, and I hate to say it, but I miss going to school. I hate being home all day." So face-to-face interactions with students is fundamental to supporting their mental health. And now the shuffling between in-person, hybrid, and remote has caused some confusion for our children as they try to navigate their interactions with these face-to-face relationships with teachers and school staff. And this has taken a toll, and parents are seeing it. So according to a recent Gallup poll of parents across our country, nearly 3 in 10 parents said that their child is already experiencing harm to their mental or behavioral health because of social distancing. And another 14% of parents indicate that their children are approaching their limits. They could continue social distancing a few more weeks until their mental health will start to suffer. So what might this look like in a child? Although there is some potential light at the end of the pandemic tunnel, our students are just generally feeling emotionally exhausted after dealing with the frequent changes, fears, communications, expectations about school and extracurricular, and I believe, frankly, the threat and the understanding about the virus itself. So the expression of what you see on this slide varies obviously greatly by developmental age, but there are just some commonalities. So again, going back to this anxiety about the future, this loss of future-oriented thinking. And you could see them being more reactionary because they've lost a little bit of their sense of control and self-efficacy in the world around them. Significant changes in mood that are unusual, that you've never really seen before, and changes in sleep or appetite problems. Free-floating anger or irritability that appears to come on with no trigger. On the other hand, you could see a numbness to emotions or numbness to the changing circumstances, just a general sense of apathy. You could see less interest in those activities they previously enjoyed. So through my private practice, I work with a 17-year-old girl who has always been involved in a number of extracurriculars, very busy with those, and was very passionate about them. And over the last year, I've seen this shift, and I've seen her interest and commitment to all of her extracurriculars really deteriorate. And these were things that kept her going. And just last week, I heard her say, "I don't think I'm going to do any of these anymore." So this just speaks to me to this emotional exhaustion that students are experiencing. There could be self-isolation and generally a loss of security, but also trust in the world around them. And you can see behavior disruptions or avoidance of talking about emotions or talking about circumstances. So now, how to support our children? The most significant thing we can do is to have meaningful conversations with our children, and not just them, but with all of us around us right now. So listen without judgment. The moment that we start interrupting conversations and taking over with solutions, the sooner our children will feel like perhaps they were wrong in bringing it up, and will close up and stop talking. So I just recently did the opposite of this with my son. He went to play outside he went out to our backyard to play with one of his neighbor friends. And unknowingly to us, and embarrassingly to me as a parent, he then with this neighbor friend walked down to a couple houses down the street within our neighborhood. And they were having a daytime get together, this house. Based on the number of cars I saw outside, I would probably call this a party. And so we saw the cars and immediately went to escort my son home. And he and we have been so careful over the last year. We've followed all of the guidelines, and we've done holidays over Zoom and birthday parties, socially distanced, and worn our masks. But we were amiss on this one. So I sat down with my son and intensely started talking to him about how careful we have been, Was anyone wearing masks? How many students were you around? Did this make you feel uncomfortable? And on and on and on I went. And he then started whimpering, and he's 7, turning 8, not crying, but chin trembling and then looking down. And at that moment, I realized in my worry, I caused him to just shut down and feel ashamed, which was the last thing I wanted to do. So I think this just is a good reminder that we are not perfect parents, especially now because we're having to learn how to parent and support during a pandemic. And it looks different because we have new worries now. So I think we should just all have compassion for ourselves as we embrace these new conversations with our children. Next, empathy. That's all we really need to do is validate their experience. So I think if an adolescent avoids or frankly refuses to talk to you, I would say don't be alarmed, because this is somewhat developmentally appropriate and we shouldn't take it personally, right? Just keep trying, because sometimes the continued offerings of support and questioning is all your young person needs to feel loved for, cared, and understood. And our goal is not to eliminate the sources of anxiety, especially because we can't eliminate this one now, but to help our children cope, manage, and tolerate a healthy level of anxiety so that this anxiety doesn't disrupt their sense of self. I think we should avoid avoiding and avoid telling our children, don't worry, it's okay, because this could invalidate their experience just like it would ours. So there's sort of a balance there. Develop calm down strategies for heightened anxiety. So for younger kids, this looks like sometimes it's sensory in nature. And for older kids, they may need more intentional mindfulness or deep breathing, or have a single specific person that they can turn to when they're feeling anxious. And encourage your child to talk, but on their own time and on their own pace. We need to come from a place of curiosity with questions and not solutions. And listen with every ounce of ourselves, because the most powerful tool we can bring to a young person's life is simply just listening. More about how to support children through this pandemic, again, continues to suggest the validation of anxiety. So model emotional tools and self-regulation activities. One of the ways I think that this can be done that's powerful is to sit down and make a list of those things that haven't changed during the pandemic, maybe within your family or within your community. As a parent, look for triggers, specific triggers like time of day, specific stressors that may have occurred prior to the disruption or the avoidance, and difficulty with specific transitions. And then pay attention also to what helped them calm down. And we can really highlight that coping skill for them and offer them praise at their use of this. I think honor the path of least resistance, especially right now. So I think this supports us and allows for more space for connection. I think of this when I think about when we first started remote learning. So my son and I, we did our best, but I became so panicked when towards the end of the year, I saw how his kindergarten handwriting had really regressed. So I grabbed on tightly and sat and worked and pushed and was really holding on too tightly. And it took his teachers, who already had enough on their plate, to really calm me down and to remind me that we and he are going to recover from this. So provide age-appropriate information. We've talked about this since the beginning of the pandemic, but I think it's important now as the messages are starting to change. So for younger children, I think this continues to be about how to keep each other safe, talking about the vaccine, why people are getting it, and how it is supporting our communities. And for older children, this is about giving them facts so they can make decisions about their actions and give them this sense of control over their environment. So think about what types of opportunities can we provide to give all children this sense of control in their environment, to make choices about their actions. Structure and normal routine, we know, create safety, and schedules can be made together, and they're helpful when they're visual. I would just say though that many of us are probably working virtually at home and are also now managing the shifting school schedules between in-person, remote, hybrid, and quarantines. And so when you build these schedules, I think it's just important that they're realistic and sets the stage for your well-being as well. I think we should play purposefully. I think we need to remind ourselves and feel the freedom to highlight play, laughter, silliness, and humor. Talk and plan for the future. And I think this is perfect timing because we can start to make plans for the summer. So we don't know exactly what the summer is going to look like, but we know a little bit more now, so we can offer some semblance of prediction and hope. And then finally, again, find grace. Because this time is stressful for us all, we might make mistakes and not be our best parenting self, but it's really about how we model correcting our mistakes and what we do next. So there are times when we as parents and school staff just can't provide the level of support our children need when they're in a mental health crisis. So some of these signs that you might see when it's time to seek out professional support are significant changes in mood or behavior. And this goes well beyond what we talked about on the other slide, things that are causing you concern. Isolation from their peers, and like I said, other supports and their activities, and changes in their appearance that are significant. So changes in hygiene or dress or new habits of taking care of themselves. And then having thoughts or expressions or acting on self-harm. And you may also see thoughts and or conversations that are sort of flavored with topics around death or dying. So when you see any of these signs, or just worried in general that your efforts aren't enough, reach out and get help immediately from a mental health professional. So one of our great resources in our state is the Colorado Crisis Services. And this is a service where any child can call and have a conversation with a mental health provider confidentially 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They can call or text, and there are also walk-in clinics across our state. I think it's also important to know that us as parents can also use this as a resource in trying to support our children. So you can call and they will provide resources and help direct you in the right direction. So below the surface is their youth support campaign coming from a group of youth from El Paso. And they really developed this campaign after experiencing a number of suicides in their school community. According to the Healthy Kids Colorado survey, youth who have an adult to talk to are 3.5 times less likely to attempt suicide. Below the surface, this campaign is really based on that premise. So on the slide, you can see some of the below the surface's messages that were designed by youth and are for youth. And you can sort of see the themes here: longing for connection, for normalcy, for future. I think it's also important to know that you can find a provider in your local area. And I would just say, don't hesitate to interview them to make sure you find the exact right fit for your child and your family. And then reaching out to our schools for support and making sure that if you have a child in a mental health crisis or needing more intensive supports, that your school and you are working together to provide seamless services throughout the day. So now, what can schools do and how can we advocate for these supports? Schools and classrooms are really important coping places for students. They have important structures and routines, and they're seeing the gravity also of mental health concerns, both virtually and when they're in person in classrooms. So I've heard from many school leadership that they're trying to understand this balance right now between academics and social emotional learning and supports. One Colorado school district affirmed social emotional learning needs to be paramount over academics right now and likely into next year. The superintendent of East Grand School District said, after this year of turmoil, almost every decision we've been making lately is really weighted in that social emotional piece as much as anything academic. All of our 178 school districts across our state are in this balancing act, really trying to figure out how to support students, balance academics and mental health needs. And as we know, this has really taken a toll on school staff. So I hear with the districts that I'm working with across the state that school staff wellness has really risen to be a top priority for districts and for schools. But it's a tricky one because people are trying to figure out how to support school staff when they're so busy and there's so little time in the day. And students have been pivoting throughout the year, but I think we also need to remember that so have our school staff, and they in an instant had to learn new skills and new technology and trying to reach out to students that they're worried about that maybe they couldn't see, learning how to connect and teach with masks. The list of their Herculean effort can go on. So many of us acknowledged the compromise and endless effort of our healthcare workers during the pandemic. And I think we have to do the same for those that work in our schools. They have truly made this year possible in whatever form it's looked like. So school mental health matters, always and now. So students are 2 times more likely to seek mental health supports when they're offered at school as opposed to in the community. So this is why schools can really be optimal places to provide mental health prevention and promotion, as well as resources and referrals to more intensive supports. So according to the National Center for School Mental Health, there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are a set of evidence-based best practices that when implemented together, create a comprehensive system of supports that can support all students, families, and staff, which we just know is more important that we focus on now more than ever. So one of those best practices is to develop teams to guide initiatives. Some districts call these wellness teams or mental health teams. What's important about these teams is that they're multidisciplinary and they include parent and student voice to guide mental health programming. The practice of universal screening, which some districts are screening social, emotional, or mental health needs in all students in their student body. And this practice is really becoming more widespread over the last few years in our state. And it's such an important practice because it can help us to identify those students that weren't on our radar, that are at risk of self-harm or that just need more intensive supports. Universal screening can also provide schools and districts with valuable information so that they can make data-informed decisions about mental health and social emotional programming that targets the very specific issues that emerged through the screening. And then using a multi-tiered system of support as a framework for mental health. So as many of you know, the multi-tiered system of support is a 3-tiered pyramid that tells us how to allocate resources that reaches universal all students, some students, and then targeted intensive interventions for few students. And we've used this as an academic framework for many years. And I think it's important for us to consider this as a framework for how we organize and allocate mental health services. So integrate social emotional learning into everyday academics and everyday school conversations. This is the best practice as opposed to social emotional pull-out classrooms or curriculums. And highlight prevention programming, including suicide prevention and cyberbullying, now that students have just more access and more integration with technology. And trauma-informed practices. We know that some students have experienced increased trauma and their first traumatic experiences as a result of being home and school closures and isolation. So having a trauma-informed school culture and trauma-informed practices in the classrooms will really prevent re-traumatization of those students but we'll also make sure that our schools are safe and secure environments for every student. So now turning to how we can protect and support our own mental health. We say self-care, practice self-care. I think we sometimes need to be a little careful with this term because it can bring to mind all those obvious things we all know we should be doing to support our physical and mental health. And while we should be doing those things, I think self-care is also just about attuning to yourself every day. And so sometimes self-care might look like staying in your pajamas all day, or going for a run, or binge watching a TV show. And so I think all of these are okay as long as they're done in moderation and as long as you're attuning to what you need each day. And self-care is fluid and really might look different from one week to the next week. So first, cultivate your own resilience. Reflect on questions like, what are the strengths or insights that I showed up with in this situation? Or what have I learned about myself or about my most important relationships? And consider how during this most trying experience, you might actually help your future self. So reflecting on such questions can reveal growth or benefits that we maybe hadn't considered, even if it doesn't change our negative reality. It's a new appraisal, which is a step towards building internal resilience. You can also, again, developing routines. We know this is important for children, but it's also important to ground us in our own well-being. And again, having this healthy, informed relationship with media, especially as the messages are changing. And so I just think it's important to be intentional about your access to media and think about when, how, and why you want to access information. Focus on the present, but again, don't lose sight of the future. Engage in helping efforts in your community. These helping activities really promotes positive mental health and connection. And set boundaries to protect your own well-being. So as many of us shifted to a virtual and online working world at home, the boundaries became a bit blurred. I know for myself, when I shifted to 100% remote, the computer never turned off and the work never got off my kitchen table, and it was just constantly there and I was constantly working. And so again, this is sort of about really being intentional about when the workday is over and turning it all off. And staying connected is of utmost importance. So remember that isolation and loneliness were cited as the #1 cause of increased depression and anxiety among youth, according to the Mental Health America screens. This trend, they also found in adults. And so we know that connection promotes resilience. And through support and human relationships, we can also find collective healing. So just as we can see COVID-19 as collective trauma, we can all see this as a collective healing experience. So in fact, research has found that the sense of perceived support is actually more important and impactful to our mental health than the actual proximity to live support. So we've all learned a lot about physical health. But I would argue we've also learned a lot about our own and others' mental health since the onset of COVID-19 a year ago. So we've learned all the things. We've learned how to wash our hands and how to wear masks and how to stay socially distanced. But I think we've also learned some things that we maybe just want to keep as life maybe turns to normal as we move in the future, or a new normal. And so while there is this sense of opening up and restrictions loosening, I hope we don't lose sight of some of these lessons learned. So I think I've learned and I've observed that as a community and as humans, we adapted quickly and dramatically. And I think we always knew, but we can see so clearly now, educators and parents are superheroes. And telehealth works. So we have been able to reach so many more people across our state through telehealth and really support mental health for children and adults alike in really creative ways. And for some of us, myself included, I learned that family matters more than I knew. And so do traditions. And these can really be created in any circumstance. And I think finally, despite all the turmoil in so many different ways, I think I see messages that tell me that we are all inherently kind and resilient. So last, hope is the most essential feeling we can all cultivate right now and always. So we can instill and teach hope by talking about stories of hope and healing that have emerged out of communities across the world during the pandemic. And we can support each other to instill hope through these helping projects. So when we support and help others, this brings us hope, as well as serving to bring hope to them. And this process is a well-being process that is contagious. So out of community and mutual support and experiences, we can find hope and give hope because we've all experienced this together. So a recent article in the Washington Post discussed something that they do yearly called the World Happiness Report. And what it found was that the indicators of happiness and resilience haven't changed since the beginning of the pandemic. And so while I think this is surprising, I really think it tells us that there is such a power in being connected in a very trying environment. So according to this year's happiness report, the ability to count on others was a major support and indicator to life evaluations in 2020. So the author said the discourse right now is so much on the negative side of things, and for very good reason, he said. But I do think that this is a story about hope. So without diminishing or dismissing the very real suffering that we've experienced as a global population, we are seeing evidence of a society that is not crumbling. So as you all likely know, we used to howl at 8 p.m. For our frontline workers and for those that we couldn't connect with or that we couldn't see. And while this tradition has faded as the consequences and practices of COVID-19 have become more embedded in our lives, I think it's still important to remember this tradition, which was really embraced by our state as a community. So again, we held to connect. And I did this with my son, and it was just incredible to see the joy and excitement and hope it brought to him every night as he talked about who he was howling for. So this is truly hope, and hope is so important because we find connection, resilience, and healing as we begin to look towards the future. So now I'll just open it up for any questions. I'll stop sharing.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat just yet, but I'll give y'all a few minutes. I was wondering, Sarah, I think, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, I see this in my practice, and it's just kind of heartbreaking, actually. But so as a lot of the people on this group will be, local unit PTA leaders, are there things you feel like PTA could maybe be involved in the school or advocating for the children to have? I mean, it's certainly difficult. I think some of the districts, they really struggle, of course, with like the funding piece and everything. But what would you say would be where maybe we would put our priorities and have the most impact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can speak anecdotally, really, about my work with districts, especially right now. And I think I talked a little bit about this idea of a comprehensive school mental health strategy, and there really is such a thing. There are, as I mentioned, these specific best practices, and I think a couple are really more important right now and are tangible things that districts could do. So I think that universal social, emotional, or mental health screening is just a really important indicator of identifying those students that we may not have eyes on. And people often ask, do we do this virtually? How do we do this screening? And districts vary. Some districts don't feel comfortable with it, and other districts are doing it virtually. And then developing ways to process that data and to make sure that they have a connection to support that student immediately. So I think the practice of universal screening is really important. And then just generally really highlighting, supporting districts and schools to highlight and to focus on that social emotional piece, because we all know students can't learn if they're not mentally healthy. And in fact, this is my favorite statistic, not my favorite one, but one of my favorite ones, is that students that are exposed to embedded social emotional learning in their classrooms demonstrate a 17 percentile point increase in academic achievement scores. So I think this data is just really helpful when you're talking to schools and saying, academics are so important and that's our job, but here are some tools and here's a way to help academics and help our students thrive.
Yeah, that's a great statistic. Not great, but great to use. There's a couple questions coming through the chat. So Lauren was wondering, you mentioned a couple of calming strategies for kids at home. Could you reiterate a couple of those that would be appropriate for elementary kids?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've done is create a calm down box. And again, I sort of said this is sometimes with younger kids, often these calm down strategies are really sensory in nature. And so create a calm down box and let the child really pick out sensory items or artifacts or things tangible things that they can put in their box and do and hold on to when they're experiencing sort of disruption or heightened anxiety. So this could be like a fidget spinner or those cords, or sometimes students need to chew on something when they're feeling anxious. So any of those things can go in their calm down box that only they have access to. I also think having a calm down space in the house and really creating this intentional, okay, we're feeling anxious, go to your safe calm down space. And maybe they bring their box, but they know that they have one space in the house that is safe for them. And this applies to the classroom too, right? Having a safe, consistent, calm down space in the classroom where students can go if they're feeling dysregulated.
Great. Lindsay asks, are there links we can share with our local districts to add to our counseling corner?
Links, yeah. Well, I think one of the things I could offer out in terms of links is the National Center for School Mental Health just recently created a very comprehensive school mental health. They used to call it a curriculum until they got some feedback, so it's no longer called a curriculum, but I can't remember the exact term, but it is like an implementation guide that really walks advocates and schools and districts through different mental health strategies. And it can be used, it comes with slide presentations that you could bring to your school or district. It lists best practices and quality indicators. And I think this is a great resource, and things can be pulled out or you can use the curriculum as a whole. But that's something with the National Center for School Mental Health has just produced. I also think the National Center for Traumatic Stress Network has a lot of very updated information about trauma and mental health on their website that I think is very relevant to schools, so that they become really in tune with the degree of trauma that will be and is already appearing in schools.
Those are great, thank you. Darcy asked, do you know how the rollout of 3 free sessions for all Colorado school-age children will happen?
No, I don't.
I think that's just in the works, right? I think it's pretty recent. So, and if we hear anything, Darcy will certainly try to share it out from Colorado PTA too. Shell would like to know, is there a way we can find and distribute a Stories of Hope quote from other schools and communities, like a go-to venue for us to read?
Hmm. I don't, I, will you read that question again? Because I don't know of anything that's already
Yeah.
prepared, but I like the idea.
Yeah, she was just asking, is there a way we can find and distribute a stories of hope from other schools and communities, like a go-to venue for us to read? I
Uh-huh.
like that idea too, Shell. I wonder even about having, we have like membership Mondays on our, social media and stuff. And I think it would be neat to have, maybe we have mental health Mondays and share stories of hope. Or, I think that we have a lot of opportunity there from a PTA standpoint. And I would love, if you're interested in working on that, let me know. And I would love to help with that. But I don't know of anything. Do you know of anything that
No,
exists?
no, I don't, but I love this idea and would be happy to participate in some capacity because I think it is so important to really highlight. A lot of schools and districts are doing some amazing things right now. And so I think it's really important for everyone to know that. And as you all probably know very well, that when a school or district hears of a successful implementation strategy about mental health or social emotional programming, that then encourages the neighboring school or district, right, to then implement that. And so it really creates this momentum, I think, in our communities. So I would be happy to partner in working on something like that.
That would be great. And Shell was saying she thinks that would be a great resource too. So Shell, maybe we'll tap into you if you're interested in helping out with that, and Sarah too. And I think that's a great idea too. I love the idea of just, I tell patients that every day, sometimes all we have is hope. So any other questions anybody has? Doesn't look like any. I'm going to post the link to the workshop evaluation here. And we have recorded our workshops and we'll kind of edit it, and we're planning on having them available at a later time. And Sarah has been kind enough to work with our board before, and hopefully she'll stick around as well. And thank you for being so on it this morning, because we had a time snafu and she was just prepared and ready to go. So thank you for that. And for the rest of you, you're all going to be transitioning back to our main room at 10 o'clock. And we'll see you all there. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.